The country of East Germany only spent about 40 years at the Olympic Games. However, for quite a time it was one of the best and top competitors there. Between 1948 and 1988, the German Democratic Republic, otherwise known as East Germany, won a total of 519 Olympic medals. For a comparison, the Soviet Union won about 1,204 medals, and the USA won 1,053 medals within the same time frame. However, East Germany had a population of only about 18 million people, whereas in the US and the USSR, the population was easily 10 times the size of that. So how did East Germany get so good at winning all these Olympic medals? Drugs. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, the state-sponsored systematic doping program run by the government in East Germany. But first, how did East Germany become East Germany? The German Democratic Republic, despite its name, was not technically democratic, but was actually an authoritarian communist state that was aligned with the USSR and what was behind essentially the Iron Curtain. Near the end of World War II, Soviet forces invaded Berlin and East Germany. When the war was over, Germany was split into two parts, one of which being divided into three parts, where there was a British, French, and American zone, which would later become West Germany, and East Germany, which was run by the Soviet Union. Within East Germany was the capital of Berlin, which was again separated, divided in half, and was West Berlin and East Berlin. And this is also where the Berlin Wall was set up. So with East Germany behind the Iron Curtain, they essentially became a Soviet satellite state. Now, sports during the Cold War is a whole other topic on itself, and this is just a small piece of it, however, but the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR, which I'll probably be referring to it as because German Democratic Republic is a little bit of a tongue twister. This country has its own unique history with sports and a relationship with sports for this time frame. Similar to the USSR, the GDR devoted much time and money and investing into its athletes to gain international fame and attention, to basically have little mini sporting wars with other countries and different sports thing. They basically just wanted to show that they were the best, and the only way you could do it at this time was through sports. And they basically did whatever they could to achieve this. Now, in the early 1960s, the GDR state began programs which would aid its national athletes to become the best in the world. They wanted to show that a socialist state was the best state, the most powerful state, and better than other capitalist countries like Britain or the USA. Now, the GDR started setting up a lot of youth sport programs where state officials would screen a lot of young children to see who would probably have the best potential of winning Olympic golds or international championships for different events. Later, these children with that really high potential would start highly specialized training programs at ages as young as 10 to 12 years old, and this was going to be their job for the rest of their lives. Now, they also divided sport into two sections. They had Sport 1 and Sport 2. Now, Sport 1s were things like athletics, gymnastics, and swimming. Now, Sports 2s were things like archery, shooting, karate, and like table tennis. Now, Sports 1s were the sports where you could basically get the most bang for your buck. Individual athletes could win multiple medals in different events. The sports were more popular. They believed there was more prestige to be won in some of these sports that were considered kind of pure sports, where you didn't have other bits and pieces getting in your way. Now, Sports 2s were things that weren't as popular, that needed a little bit more specialized training and didn't rely necessarily on strength or physicality. They were more skill-based and talent-based. So the GDR decided to devote most of their time to the Sport 1s, which, I mean, does make a lot of sense. If you can train one athlete to run really, really well, you might be able to get them to win 4 or 5 gold medals. But if you train one athlete to do karate really well, there's only really one event they can win. Now, during this time, advances in medicine and science created things like steroids, human growth hormones, and amphetamines, which were being used in athlete training. Now, a lot of these drugs became widely available for both men and women in the 1960s and were used freely, consequences basically unknown. In the Olympic Games in the 1960s, there were athletes from all over the world using these training aids and not necessarily being tested for them. It was basically just a free-for-all. Anyone who could get their hands on these expensive drugs was using them. It became such a problem that in 1967, the International Olympic Committee banned the use of performance-enhancing drugs in all of their competition. And slowly after that, many other international sporting bodies did this as well. They also started doing a mandatory testing for all athletes to see if any of them were using these illegal and banned substances. Of course, after this, a lot of athletes started to being caught. At the next Olympic Games in 1968, there were a handful of athletes from all over the world that were caught doping or some form of steroid or something that was considered a banned substance. Now, at the 1968 Mexico City Games, East Germany won a total of 25 medals, with 9 of those being gold. Now, no East German athlete was caught doping at this Games. There were a handful of other international athletes, as I've just said, that were caught doping. So it's not until the 1972 Munich Games that the GDR really stepped up its game. The Games, it won a total of 66 medals, with 20 of those being gold. And within a 4-year period, they basically doubled their medal output. And for a country of 18 million, it was ranking with some of the best and some of the biggest countries in the world. And also beating quite a few of them. During the 1976 Montreal Olympics, the German Democratic Republic went on and nearly doubled their medal count again, with a total of 60 medals, with 40 of those being gold. Also, when we talk about the Winter Olympics, at the 1972 Sapporo Games, East Germany finished second with a total of 14 medals, 4 of those being gold. At the 1976 Innsbruck Games, they again came in second with a total of 19 medals, and 7 of those being gold. Now, out of those 4 Olympic Games that I've just mentioned, no East German athlete was caught doping or tested positive for any form of banned substance. Their performance really surprised the world, how this tiny little country that's just come out of a big wars, making reparation payments, has been destroyed by what happened in World War II, is all of a sudden one of the top athletic contenders on the international stage and has some of the best athletes in the world. A lot of people just assume that maybe this was kind of their outlet to show that East Germany was going back into the international world. There's a whole mix of different things, but people didn't necessarily believe that it was due to drugs. Kind of at this point. After the 1972 Olympics, the IOC had actually upped their game in testing athletes for performance-enhancing drugs. They kind of improved their science, improved their testing facilities. Still, the German Democratic Republic was able to slip through the cracks. I wanted to specifically talk about the 1976 Montreal Games, as it's kind of where people start catching on that maybe GDR is doing a little bit more than really good training programs. And this was very evident in women's events, in particular women's swimming. Now, the American men's swimming team basically won all of the men's medals that were there, including relays and individual events, whereas the East German women won 13 out of the 15 women's swimming events. Ironically, no one thought that the American men were doping because they won all the events, but everyone started complaining about East Germany at this point. So I'm going to list off a couple of East German women athletes who won some medals at the Games. So the first one, Petra Tümer, won both the 400 and 800 meter freestyle. Ulrich Richter won the 100 meter, 200 meter backstroke and was part of the gold medal 4x100 relay team. Was the champion of the 100 meter breaststroke and was again part of a 4x100 relay gold medal team. Ulrich Tauber won the 400 meter medley and got a silver in the 200 meter butterfly. And probably one of the more well-known athletes, Cornelia Ender, won the 100 and 200 meter freestyle, the 100 meter butterfly, and was part of the gold medal 4x100 meter medley team and came in second in the 4x100 freestyle team. There are other GDR female athletes that won swimming in these events, but these are all the people who won golds. There was also actually a couple of complete podium sweeps by GDR. An American athlete by the name of Shirley Babisoff won 1 gold and 4 silvers. All those silvers were second place to a GDR athlete. Now, Babisoff was really outspoken in accusing the GDR team of doping or not actually being women. Now, along with her teammates, they would say things to the media about the very masculine appearance of the GDR athletes. They would compare their physical appearance to men. They would talk about their muscle build and how the girls' American team actually at least looked like women. Now, for her remarks, the media labeled her as Surly Shirley and basically called her a bad loser. It's ironic considering that in a couple of years she'll actually be right. But at this games, no female GDR athlete tested positive for any form of doping or steroids. Now, even with the media labeling Babashoft Surly Shirley, there were who believed in her accusations. And I mean, she was right to be a little peed off. If East Germany hadn't actually competed at the Olympic Games, she would have won 5 gold medals and 1 bronze. Now, was it just good sports training and development programs, or was there something more sinister at work at GDR? Now, into the 1980s, GDR continued to be one of the best nations in the world athletically, and people started to get a lot more suspicious. However, things kind of hit the fan for GDR in the late 1970s. In 1977, shot putter Ilona Supanek tested positive for steroids at a European championship. The IAAF suspended her for a year of competition. Now, exactly after her suspension ended, there was another European Championships for 1978. Now, as she was just banned from competition, from competing at all, she basically went back home to East Germany and continued to train without any form of other testing or anything. So she was basically just let go with all the drugs and stuff that they were putting into her, and she continued training. She came back to the 1978 European Championships and won gold. She later won gold again in 1979, then in 1981, then in 1982, and then won an Olympic gold medal for it in 1980. After her positive test in 1977, she didn't test positive again for any form of performance-enhancing drugs. Basically, what probably happened is she was sent home, and all the scientists and doctors were looking at it, trying to figure out how to make a positive test not actually positive. They basically worked on putting whatever drugs they could into her, making her the strongest and best she could without having to do any form of testing, and then she showed up as basically Wonder Woman to the 1978 European World Championships. Now, after Supanek positively tested for performance-enhancing drugs publicly, the GDR began testing their athletes before they actually went on to any form of international or national competition. They actually would test them even before they left the country to make sure that there was nothing popping up in their system. Now, if they did test positive before they left the country, a lot of the times what would happen is an injury would pop up or a medical condition would somehow arise. And how they did that was a lot of the doctors were working for the government, and they basically would just make up some form of illness and basically get them to write off whatever competition they were going to be going to. This was the first positive test for any form of performance-enhancing drug or banned drug for an East German athlete in about 20 years. Also at this time, there were many East German athletes who were defecting to Western nations. From 1976 to 1979, there were about 15 athletes who defected. Many of them went to Western media or Western organizations and told their stories. One of the most well-known was sprinter Neufeld, who fled the German Democratic Republic in 1977. Talked about her incredibly strict training regime and the vitamins that were given to her for her recovery, and how there are many athletes in the country who didn't make it through the super strict training regime and were now considered invalids by the state. Basically, their bodies began to fall apart and they could no longer function as athletes, let alone being able to do simple things in a day. Now, she talks specifically about her reason as to why she defected. She had been told to take these pills and were told that they were vitamins. As her performance improved after taking the pills, however, she began growing a mustache, her voice started to become more gruff, and her period completely stopped. When she refused to continue taking the pills, the secret police brought her and her fiancé into government buildings and questioned them as to why she refused to take the pills. Eventually, she fled the country with her fiance and these packets of pills and showed them to Western media. Now, scientists and doping experts tested what she had brought over and discovered they were in fact a concoction of anabolic steroids. Now, other athletes also told their stories about how as children they were given injections into their knees, that they had to wear corsets because the joints in their back were degrading and they couldn't sit up straight, and how their bodies had drastically changed since joining these sporting programs and taking these vitamins. Here between 1980 and 1990, not much was necessarily done about this doping, and this was due to a couple different things, the big one being the big double Olympic boycott. The 1980 games were set to be held in Moscow, Soviet Union, and all Western nations, I can say Western. All Western nations, basically anyone who had any form of alliance with like the United States, boycotted the Olympics due to the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan. Later, the 1984 games were set to be held in Los Angeles of the USA, and all Eastern Bloc nations, or those aligned with the USSR, boycotted for retaliation of the boycott, but also there's some other issues going on. So at the 1980 games, no single athlete tested positive for any form of performance-enhancing drug, even though you look at a chart of how many people test positive year by year by year. 1980 is the only year where there's no one who's tested positive since they started regularly testing athletes, which I think says a lot. And at the 1984 Los Angeles Games, there were no East German athlete who attended or competed. Even though there was first-hand experience and evidence about this kind of systematic doping program and that the German Democratic Republic was doping its athletes, they weren't able to basically get a positive test result from an athlete. Basically weren't able to 100% prove it. Now, the GDR doping program was so just like highly advanced that it was way ahead of whatever other international sporting organization had at this time, hence why they were able to fly under the radar. Anytime some new form of testing came up, they had already figured out to basically delete that from a person's history or have everything washed out before they actually went to a big Olympic event. At the 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics and at the 1988 Calgary Winter Olympics, no German Democratic athlete actually tested positive for doping either. As history goes, in 1990, the Berlin Wall fell down and East Germany and West Germany came together to form the Federal Republic of Germany. Now, about a year later, an organization was set up by the Federal Republic of Germany, set up in its police department. It was called the Central Investigations Office for Government and Reunification Crimes, and they were tasked with looking at the doping policies that East Germany had. They weren't just looking at the doping, they were also looking at other things like disappearances in the borders, unlawful imprisonment, anything shady that went down in East Germany. They were there looking into it. Now, they planned on interviewing about 1,000 athletes who they believed were affected, had some form of evidence stating they were affected, or knew about the kind of doping program that was going on. However, they only received about 300 testimonies, and as about 700 of those other people believed they would be held accountable in some way, knew they were accountable in some way, or would face public scrutiny, which I think at this point it's pretty fair. Now, this criminal office basically put together a big folder with tons of different evidence and testimonies, and they put it out into the public for everyone to read and to know about. So in the aftermath of all of this, all the information being released, files from the secret police, files from the East German government, there were a number of things that were discovered. Now, the difference between what East Germany was doing with its athletes as opposed to just other athletes who were doping on an individual basis was the fact that in East Germany it was a state policy. There had been numerous athletes who had been caught and or gotten away with doping while all of this was happening. Big names like Ben Johnson had been caught and disqualified from their event. However, a lot of these athletes outside of East Germany who had been caught and disqualified for taking drugs did it knowingly or had invested in taking these drugs. And they kind of did it on a personal basis with them and their trainer, whereas in East Germany, all athletes were forced to take these drugs whether or not they knew they were taking them. So it was a state policy, which does make it a little bit different. With the government having this organized and very sophisticated systematic doping system for all of its athletes was probably one of the reasons why they were able to fly under the radar for so long. Able to throw all of their money, all of their time, all of their effort, all their science, everything into it to ensure that these athletes were not getting caught. And when you have a government backing you in order to get something done, it's a lot easier to do it than if you're just an individual athlete on your own with your trainers and your coaches. With it being a state policy, as I mentioned, a lot of athletes didn't actually know what they were taking when their doctors and their trainers were giving it to them in pills or injecting them with stuff. A lot of these people were told that they were vitamins or some form of agent to help with muscle recovery, a mix of different things. Now, a lot of these drugs were given to children even as young as 10 years old. Many didn't actually know they were taking it. There were a few athletes who actually admitted to knowing they were taking them and willingly taking them, such as decathlete Christian Schneck. He actually admitted to using steroids during his career and said that he wasn't really naive about what was going on either, and still went on with it, and it helped him in his athletic career greatly. Also, specifically at the 1976 Montreal Games, all of the women who had won gold medals and many who had won silver and bronze medals admitted, or it was confirmed, that they had taken performance-enhancing drugs at the 1976 Games. Also, evidence and documentation came out that a lot of these syringes or packets or extra stuff was actually just thrown into Montreal's St. Lawrence River when the Olympics were done. After all of this came out, investigations and procedures went into it, and in 2000 there was a trial. Manfred Ewald, who was the German Democratic Minister of Sport and later the president of the country's Olympic Committee, and Manfred Hoppener, which was the kind of the top country sport physician and doctor, both were basically put on trial for their role in this systematic doping country thing that was going on, and they were charged with stuff for like giving drugs to minors, giving drugs to people all unknowingly, all that jazz. And what they in turn did was blame the East German government and said that they had been told from all the way up at the top to do all this stuff, so they just kept trying to lay the blame elsewhere. Athletes, specifically some of the swimmers that I mentioned earlier, but Andrea Pollack and Danielle Hunger also testified against them. They talked about their health issues, issues with the reproductive system, their joints, their bodies, their bones, and how they're all over general health, and how a lot of these steroids and drugs affected their future life, their current health, and even their families as well. Now, after that big trial, the German government has begun to financially compensate those who were affected by the East German government's doping system. So far, about 10.5 million euros has been given to affected athletes, of which there are about 167. This topic, who I mentioned earlier, Shirley, the American who said, "At least I look like a woman," said only 167 people. So she wasn't really happy about that either. But in other cases where athletes have been caught doping, they're normally disqualified from the event, and any record or medal is removed from their kind of roster. So after this big investigation came out, a lot of different sporting organizations, like British and American ones, petitioned the IOC to basically remove every single East German athlete from the record books, strip them of all their medals, and take away all the world records. However, the IOC has stated that they're not really planning on doing this anytime soon, even with confirmation of this whole system and confirmation that athletes were doped during certain times and certain events were out. Now, there's a few reasons for this. First, they don't technically have confirmed test results that these athletes were taking this amount of drugs or this type of drug during this specific event. They just have written down evidence, firsthand testimonies, but they don't actually have the exact results that they need to do something like this for. Second, they also can't confirm that everyone who was a part of it did it willingly or unwillingly. and to go and to individually strip certain athletes who willingly took the drugs or really willingly knew what was going on, as opposed to athletes who had no idea what was going on, it's not fair. So you need to have a blanket kind of statement for this. And third, I'm guessing that it would probably be a very, very complicated, long, tedious process, and there would be a lot of pushback. So they probably don't really want to get into it too much. So all of the podiums will remain as is, whereas other people like Shirley Surley will just keep going on about how she didn't get her medals. And with all of this evidence coming out against East Germany with doping, doping has become a really kind of hot topic within the sporting world. And shortly after all this came out, doping detection has become far more specialized, and it had gotten better and better and better. And then we have Russia doping for years, and that's only recently come out. But that's all its own story and its own video, which I will also probably be doing. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's there's a lot of stuff going on with this one. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you have a comment on it, please also add that too. If there's another video you'd like me to look at, like a USSR/Russia doping program, I'm super interested in doing that. Yeah, so thank you for sticking around. Hope you enjoy. Bye.